Happy New Year to everyone. A bit late now, but still Happy New Year. And welcome back to a new term and the first event with OPS. My name is Clara. I'm the current president here at Oxford Psychedelic Society. And today we are super excited to be inviting Julian Vayne with us. Who's going to be talking to us about coming out psychedelic. So not only is Julian a self-described psychonaut and occultist, he sits on board the Journal of Psychedelic Studies and is the author of multiple books, the latest being Getting Higher, the Manual of Psychedelic Ceremony. For those that haven't heard the story, we did in fact invite Julian to speak at Oxford Psychedelic Society last year, but to cut quite a long story short, he was in fact banned by one of the colleges at speaking at Oxford. So we are particularly pleased to be inviting him back now here tonight. Julian did in fact go on to publish his banned would-be lecture, and I'm going to put a copy of the link in the chat now if you want to have a look and are interested in getting a copy. Two things before we start. One of them, if you have a question as Julian's speaking, feel free to pop it in the chat, and then at the end I'll invite you to unmute yourself and you can ask your question directly to Julian. If you're currently watching on the live stream, feel free to pop a question in the comments and we'll keep an eye on those and I'll read them out myself. Secondly, we rely on donations as a society in order to be able to make these events free and accessible to people. So we really do appreciate any support that you can give us. We'll be popping a link to our PayPal in the chat in a moment as well. So thank you all for joining us tonight, and Julian, over to you.
Thank you very much, Clara. Thank you very much to the Oxford Psychedelic Society for inviting me back, let's call it, into this setting. Thank you everyone for coming along today, this evening, for those of us who are in the British Isles and Europe. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to kind of just riff on a couple of ideas and themes for about kind of 45 minutes, something like this. And then we'll have the opportunity, as Clara said, for some questions. So I think it's very helpful when, people come and say stuff to situate those people in terms of, where are they coming from? What's their interest in psychedelics, and what's the kind of connection? So I'm just going to briefly talk about a little bit in terms of my own kind of background, and also the links and the connections that I see between some of the things I'm interested in as an occultist, and some of the developments that we can see within psychedelics, and talking about really this issue of the kind of tension between things like what people do and what people say that they do, what people consider licit or illicit behaviors, and how we start to bring some of this conversation into both academic settings and perhaps also more widely to kind of recognize the context in which we have this conversation. So just a little bit briefly about me. So my background, as Clara says, I'm an occultist. Okay, so that means that basically since childhood I've been interested in weird stuff. So I'm interested in magic and the paranormal, the way the human imagination works and the limits of that, ritual processes, things that these days we might gloss under various kind of headings in terms of self-exploration, self-development, and so on. Occultism, of course, is basically the study of the mystery, that which is hidden. So it's a tradition that ultimately gives rise to things like contemporary science through the whole history of natural philosophy, influencing and being influenced by things like psychological processes, and also interested in things like that we might put in the domain of parapsychology. So there's a big link immediately for me between occultism and psychedelic substances. So I'll give you a couple of little examples of this. So when we look at, let's call them spiritual traditions that make use of psychedelic substances, we see those in significant evidence in places like India and in North and South America. We see them in Africa, in many other kind of contexts. Now, growing up as a kid, as basically a child of the late 60s, I was fascinated by those in the 1970s you get these glossy coffee table books about the occult, and it would have various kind of aspects in there. Alchemy would be represented, and ceremonial magic would be represented. And there was another interesting category called shamanism, and shamanism initially for me looked like something that was very far and very distant. You know, the people generally had darker skin than me. They usually came from cultures that were way outside, as far as I can understand it, the British Isles and even Europe. But there was this kind of interesting idea that shamans made use of magical substances in order to enter trance. And although people like Eliade, in his book Shamanism, The Archaic Techniques of Ecstasy, plays down the use of psychedelics. And although we can kind of problematize and question, you know, what it means to be a shaman, is, you know, is this an ethnographic construct of the West? Is it something that sits very much within a particular region of Mongolia, Siberia? Nevertheless, that term has kind of become a commonly used term both in academia and in popular culture to refer to a lot of things that are essentially, from my perspective, the techniques that occultists use. So things like traveling in altered states of awareness, the use of trance induction, the use of a variety of different tropes that you can see in other traditions. Now, the Western magical tradition, of course, also has an involvement with psychedelics and psychoactives. The go-to book, incidentally, at the moment is probably a book called Liber 420 by a guy called Chris Bennett, which really kind of traces the way that incenses and magical suffumigations were used in order to induce altered states of awareness in which spirits might appear. And those things were being done both in ancient cultures and also right the way up and certainly until the 19th century. But magic has a kind of a crossover with psychedelics in many other respects as well. And there are links between the way that magic has been understood and it's been approached within wider culture and also by the academy, and the way psychedelics have been approached by the academy and wider culture too. So to give you one example of that, there is probably the sort of the trip report. So the first ever sort of trip report, one might say, was written by a guy called Havelock Ellis, who was a physician and sexologist. I think it's published in something like 1898 from memory, called Mescal, A New Artificial Paradise. And it's his report of taking mescaline on the banks of the River Thames, and his account of how that experience was. This is a very interesting trip report, you know, in the same way that we could argue that most philosophy is just footnotes to Plato, perhaps all subsequent trip reports are just footnotes to Havelock Ellis. So he writes this lovely, lovely description of how it was to take mescaline back in the day. And one of the things he mentions is that he gave some mescaline to a friend of his who was an artist, who then went wandering around London and had these very sort of interesting interactions and mystical kind of insights. The artist that he gave the mescaline to was a guy called William Butler Yates. So W.B. Yeats, the well-known poet, and also a member of a thing called the Hermetic Order of the Golden Dawn, which was a group of magicians, group of occultists who were doing their stuff predominantly in Britain and the latter part of the 19th century and beginning part of the 20th century. So W.B. Yeats was a member of this organization, the Golden Dawn, and of course probably one of the most famous bad boy members of the organization was a guy called Aleister Crowley. So as a kid, I became very fascinated with the work of Aleister Crowley and read lots of it at a relatively young age. Crowley, of course, is famous for his use of psychoactive materials in the context of his occult investigations. He also arguably produced the first ever public psychedelic artwork. So in the early part of the 20th century, I think it's 1909, 1910, he did a series of rituals in London at the Caxton Hall, which were ceremonies which were designed to bring people into the presence of the, let's call it the mystical energy of the traditional 7 planets within the kind of Hermetic scheme. So, you know, the sun and the moon and Mars and so forth. So this sequence of rituals that he did, which involved poetry and ritual drama and music and various effects with lighting and incense and so on, were rituals which started off with giving the audience the opportunity to take a magic drink. So the rituals were called the Rites of Eleusis, and Crowley, in common with a number of people at the time, and indeed now, thought that the Eleusinian mysteries, the ancient mysteries of Greece and the classical world, probably involved some sort of psychoactive substance to really get the party going. So at this series of rituals, Crowley dosed the audience with the kykeon. So a kykeon is a potion, and it's the potion drunk by the initiates of Eleusis. When you went into the ancient Eleusinian mysteries, you'd have to say, I have fasted and I have drunk of the kykeon. So in the kykeon, Crowley put probably a whole bunch of entertaining things, almost certainly including mescaline. So this was only the second ceremonial event ever done with mescaline on this side of the Atlantic. And that ritual is very interesting because the reviews of it are basically divided into two categories. There are those people who didn't take the kykeon, who said, oh my God, this was incredibly boring. We had to sit on the floor like natives, and I'm quoting. It made no sense. It was all noisy and weird. And then there were those people who drunk the kykeon who said, well, I didn't really understand what was going on, but it was amazing and it was moving and it was profound and it was strange and it was all that sort of stuff. So way before the Beings, way before Hawkwind and the Grateful Dead, Crowley had created a type of artwork that was best seen when you were high. So there's an interesting kind of like connection there between these two traditions. And so my own interest in psychedelics kind of comes from that direction. So it's really interesting to look at these kind of points of contact, but it's also important, of course, to understand the kind of the wider context in which Crowley was doing his bizarre rituals, and in which later occultism and perhaps more broadly paganism started to emerge in the kind of 20th century. So paganism, as it developed from the 19th century, and particularly with its development in the latter part of the 20th century, probably one of the go-to books for the development of witchcraft anyway is a thing called Triumph of the Moon by Professor Ronald Hutton. This culture developed, but it didn't develop in a way that really brought the use of psychedelics or psychoactive substances to the fore. And the reason for that is quite understandable, because as this new religious movement was kind of on the up, so there was a gradual increase in the amount of legislation concerned with the use of, let's call them psychoactive substances. And that, of course, has led to the predicament in which we find ourselves now, and in which I found myself being banned from a certain college that shall not be mentioned at Oxford University. No, I definitely won't mention it. So thinking about the academy and its relationship with the occult, there's a really interesting kind of thing. So as paganism, occultism, all these kind of sets of ideas, what has now become known as occulture, which is a term coined by an occultist that's now been brought into the academic sphere. As this whole thing has kind of developed and it's sought for acceptance within this kind of wider cultural scene, we can see how the academy has been able to engage much more successfully with this kind of material as well. It's now seen as a legitimate part of academic exploration. And I remember being at a conference in Cambridge, I think it was, a number of years back, which was one of the first conferences where this new relationship between the academy and the occult, and particularly art, was being brought to the fore. So if you look at artists, there are many artists who, as well as perhaps using psychoactive materials, certainly were engaged in the occult. So if you look at Derek Jarman, the filmmaker, or another filmmaker, Maya Deren, experimental filmmaker of the 1940s and 50s. If you don't know these artists, particularly Maya Deren, I would say go and have a look. A lot of her work's on YouTube. So occultists and academics have been able to kind of like find this, to some degree, an accommodation, certainly a kind of a relationship. But it's interesting that there's still a degree of uncertainty, let's call it, within those cultures, within the academic side of the culture. So I was at a conference in 2018, I think it was, called Trans States, which was a conference at the university in Northampton. Where I also bumped into Alan Moore in HMV, which was nice. So anyway, I was there at this conference, and the conference was about altered states and magic. And there was this kind of lovely exhibition of artworks. There were lovely discussions. Walter Hanegraaff was there, heavy hitters in this kind of Western esoteric academic field. But it was also really interesting for me because obviously I got to talk to a number of the academics there. As I said, I don't come at this within that particular culture. Although, as Clara's mentioned, I've got connections with the academic community. But within the Trans States conference, I was able to find that there were a number of academic practitioners who didn't want to own up, let's say, or be out about their interest as just personal individuals with the occult or with any kind of esoteric, pagan, magical stuff. And there are perhaps good reasons for this. So Professor Ronald Hutton, who I mentioned earlier, author of Triumph of the Moon, there he is in Bristol. He was outed in a student newspaper as an actively practicing occultist a number of years ago. And this is a story that he tells publicly now, so I can kind of talk about it, where basically what happened was that his pay at the university was mysteriously frozen for a number of years after he produced Triumph of the Moon, the book about witchcraft, and after he'd been outed in the local newspaper, or the student newspaper rather, until he produced another book about the Druids, at which point presumably the people in charge thought, well, he can't possibly be a witch and a Druid, that doesn't make any sense, and gave him the last N years of his money back without any overt discussion about what had happened. So this is a guy who's, very successful academic. Many people here are probably familiar with his work. He's on the telly, who found himself, as a result of his declaration of interest in this field, suddenly in a situation where, although nothing overt was said, there was obviously some kind of prejudicial process that had kind of been engaged with what was going on. So we can see a parallel here with the renewed academic and scientific and broad cultural interest in psychedelics. So there's now, as everybody here I'm sure is very aware, particularly over the course of what's been called the psychedelic renaissance. I think Ben Sesser's got a book of that name. He may have coined the term. So during the psychedelic renaissance, this second wave of great research into the field, we've seen vast amounts of research being done in almost every domain that you can think of. We've got ethnographic research, we've got medical research, we've got hardcore neurological kind of research going on. We've got all sorts of work being done in those fields. But of course, it's still perhaps difficult for academics or people working in that field to come out psychedelic, to come out and say, well, actually, this is not just something I'm sort of interested in when I go into the office. This is something that's actually an important part of my own personal process in whatever way. It's also, I think, really essential to realize what's happening here. So we have, we can call this hypocrisy, we can call this, any number of kind of accusatory things. But the fact is that we have people who have engaged with psychedelics in contexts where they were not within licensed trials, and those people are the people who are finding themselves in the academic field and so on. The take-home thing I'm trying to say here is that most of those people who are doing this work are, did not start off by reading Doors of Perception, Heaven and Hell, and then doing all their work, and then finally getting to the point where they could be part of a licensed trial, and then finally taking psilocybin. That's very unlikely, and it's not the case in terms of the people that I've spoken with. Most of these people who are working in this field will have encountered these things in a context where the substances are not licensed for them to use. These are, and I quote, particularly because the lovely Darryl Butler is here, these are, quote, illegal drugs. And I'm going to mention the idea about illegal drugs and unpack that a bit, because it's quite an important point that needs to be addressed. It's very difficult for the academy to address this, and I also appreciate on a personal level how hard this can be for people. This isn't necessarily about calling people out for being hypocrites. This is just about talking about the situation in which we find ourselves. And the situation's been there for a while. Another conference. I do other things other than go to conferences, but in 2004, I was in a conference in at Bath, where it was a great event. Like Anne Shulgin and Alexander Shulgin spoke there. I had the opportunity to speak there as well. And there was a guy there called Benny Shannon. So Benny Shannon's professor of psychology at the Hebrew University of Jerusalem. And he's the author of, amongst other things, a delightful book about ayahuasca called Antipodes of the Mind. Very, very good book. Strongly recommended. It's a kind of phenomenological exploration and reading of how ayahuasca works. And at that conference, I said to, I think it was Dr. Shannon at the time, I said to Benny, what's your hope for ayahuasca? Yeah, so you've talked about these things, and you've obviously engaged with it. You've taken it many, many, many times in lots of different settings, predominantly in though not exclusively in South America, in contexts where at the time the whether it was legal or not was kind of in a lot of places quite a sort of grey area. And he was kind of floored by this question, and I didn't mean to do this. I was just saying, like, what do you hope for this? Because I think that the difficulty is that to try and move from a position where we're talking about in the abstract, oh, here are all these things, and they're very good for medicine, and they're very good for, you know, all the stuff that we know psychedelics are valuable for, to then get to the stage where we can actually own our position with that, and we can say, well, this is something that I believe should be perhaps more accessible to people, or should be accessible in various kind of ways. That's, I think, where we really need to own the discussion, and we need to bring that a bit further. Someone's just asked, what was the book? Antipodes of the Mind, Antipodes of the Mind, Benny Shannon. So we have this really, really strange situation where we have the Oxford Psychedelic Society, many psychedelic societies across the whole of the globe, and we have all these lovely conferences that I and many people here probably go to, and yet these are conferences that are being held during wartime. And we have to remember this, and we have to remember that the war on drugs, or of course, as most people know it, the war on some people who take some drugs, is still very much in evidence globally. And although that narrative is changing, where I'm speaking from in the British Isles, the narrative remains pretty resolutely in place. And although there are some moves that are happening within kind of the medical discourse to change these things, the overall narrative of illegal drugs, of the practical experience of people getting their houses raided, is still a real thing. Yeah, it is still a real thing, and the consequences are still real and significant for all the individuals who find themselves in those kind of situations. This, of course, is incredibly hypocritical from the point of view of, let's even just take the sitting government at the moment. So I guess people probably know here that Britain is the largest producer of cannabis-related medicines. So we produce, I think it's something like 44% of the global medical marijuana trade. Lots of this is produced from an 18-hectare greenhouse, which has been active since 2016 in Norfolk. So it was originally a tomato processing plant or production plant, and it's not anymore. It grows weed. So this is being grown by a company called British Sugar, who have an interesting and let's call it problematic history. As indeed sugar as a substance, as one might suggest a drug does. This is a company which includes people like Paul Kenwood, who is the managing director of British Sugar, who's married to Victoria Atkins, who's the Parliamentary Undersecretary of State. This is a company which is part of connected with the portfolio of a guy called Philip May. Philip May, who's the husband of a person called Theresa May. So we have this, we have on the one hand, I would suggest an incredibly kind of hypocritical situation in the British Isles, where even with the changes of legislation to allow doctors to prescribe cannabis, I know from people who are working in that field that although those decisions were taken, if you like, in the centre, actually distributing the mechanisms by which GPs can actually make those prescriptions has been slow to the point of it's almost like they don't want to do it, you know. And I'm not a great conspiracy theorist. I think mostly it's about cock up rather than conspiracy, but nevertheless, that's the kind of culture in which we find ourselves. This situation which has certainly is redolent of hypocrisy. we find things like psilocybin and DMT being used to look at, to treat people with depression. MDMA is being used. Ben Sessa, who I mentioned earlier, has been doing some amazing work working with people with very, very severe alcohol problems with the research he's been doing in Bristol, and having kind of amazing results. When Ben goes to get the medicine that he uses, the 2 pills, I think one is something like 120 and the other one's 80 milligrams of MDMA, he has to go and get them from a safe, from where they're stored, I think in the hospital. He has to put them in a locked suitcase, which I think is actually handcuffed to his arm, but things like that were discussed when this medicine was being moved from one place to another. The substance itself costs something in the region, I think the last time I looked at the figures, it was something like £60,000 per kilo, which is significantly more than you would expect to pay on the black market because of all the licensing and so on that's involved with it. And to be frank, and speaking as a former resident of Bristol for quite a number of years, he's taking this through Bristol, where, I mean, you know, you could pop into a bar and you might be able to get someone to sort you out. So we have this weird kind of tension, and it's kind of understandable as we go through periods of transition to have these kind of anomalous and what seem just plain bonkers kind of relationships between things. But nevertheless, this is something that is happening in our culture. We know that psychedelics are valuable. All the medical research that we have, which suggests very, very strongly that used in the appropriate set and setting, because we know these substances create a highly plastic state, so a state of awareness which can be changed in a variety of different ways. But if the experience is curated in the right way, we know that they're incredibly valuable. They're valuable for healing. They're also valuable simply in terms of people getting insights. Now, it's often said that DNA was discovered as a result of a psychedelic vision. The historical evidence for that is basically there isn't any. But there is certainly some evidence that things like Carey Mullins, who was the inventor of a thing called the polymerase chain reaction, the PCR reaction, which of course is being used as we speak to investigate and test for coronavirus. According to Albert Hofmann, from a conversation with Mullins, he used LSD to have an insight as to how the reaction might be created, and then went ahead and, you know, won a Nobel Prize in '93, I think it was, a joint Nobel Prize for this piece of work. So psychedelics can help us problem solve. And there was an interesting piece of research that was done, I think it was 2016, I think, if memory serves, which I believe Dr. David Luke was involved with, which was using LSD to find out whether or not people with what I call equal sign problems could use acid to help them figure stuff out. So an equal sign problem is not a complex problem like ethics or philosophy or art. It's a problem that often comes down to a series of engineering or mathematical or scientific insights that have a kind of a physicality, if you like, in the world. And the research that was done with LSD is very interesting. Basically, they managed to establish that there was a window of about 75 micrograms, which was the optimum window for people to figure stuff out. So that's basically not so little that you're annoyed by the experience, and not so much that you just spend all your time looking at the ceiling. So we know that these substances can help us figure stuff out. Both in terms of our own healing process, ways of being with the trauma that we might have had, ways of resolving and overcoming our addictions, and the ways of figuring out the difficulties in which we find ourselves, perhaps as engineers, as well as just humans who might be suffering from a traumatic experience. So these are very, very valuable substances. They're, of course, even more apparently valuable in contexts such as religion and artistic creation and problem solving. But we do have this tension that exists, and the tension runs really deep. So one of the tensions is this idea about illegal drugs. So as the lovely Daryl, who's here, will point out, there are no such things as illegal drugs. There can be, human beings can be licensed or not licensed to do certain things. So the LSD that was being used in those trials that I mentioned in 2016 was was not an illegal drug, because acid cannot be in and of itself illegal. It doesn't make any sense. It's not a meaningful thing to talk about. And yet we talk about this stuff all the time, because the culture in which we find ourselves is a culture where we're still very much within this kind of drug war envelope. And even though perhaps in settings like this, where we feel that we're amongst friends, we don't feel this kind of internalized oppression, nevertheless it exists. And it exists in terms of the language, in terms of policing, in terms of the hypocritical way that government or private interests will be involved in this. And yet these substances are not available for wider culture. The funny thing happened to me, as far as the story with the Oxford Psychedelic Society, really pivots to some extent on this understanding of illegal drugs. So I was going to, as a lot of people here probably know, the plan was I would come over to Oxford and I would do a lovely workshop and lecture, and that would be great, wouldn't it? We spent some time trying to find a room for this, and it became tricky. It became bizarrely tricky. This is pre-pandemic tricky. And it turned out that one of the administrators, who was apparently new in post and perhaps understandably wanted to make their mark or be showing due diligence or, doing their thing, and don't necessarily wish them any ill will, and I don't necessarily suppose they had any. But nevertheless, they looked me up and they decided that because of my statements on the record about illegal drug use, their duty of care to students meant that I couldn't speak. Now, that's really interesting, particularly given the work by the National Union of Students, I think published in 2018, which was that something like 39% of students surveyed claimed that they'd used drugs that they were not licensed to use. They'd used, quote, illegal drugs. So that's interesting. That's kind of perhaps an example of shutting the door after the horse has bolted somewhat. But the idea of illegal drugs is fascinating, because I encountered this when I was a subject in 2019 for a piece of research. So I went to King's College Hospital in London to be a participant in some psilocybin research. And in that setting, I remember, we did all the preparatory stuff and we'd done all the sort of various talks and blah, blah, blah. And there was a point at which we went to kind of meet the team who would be doing the work of sitting with us while we took the medicine. And I went into the room and I was the first one to arrive. And there were all these kind of lovely therapists in the room. And I said, this is amazing. You're all here. Brilliant. I've got a few problems I'd like to chat about. But I said to them, seriously, I said, who here has taken psilocybin? And a couple of hands went to kind of go up. And the person who was the lead researcher said, well, none of us can admit that without admitting that we've done something illegal. And I said, that's not true. There are many contexts, there are many places, including in this hospital tomorrow, where what we would be doing was not in no way criminal, in no way illegal. So even this person who basically had in their cupboard a whole batch of psilocybin pills, synthetic psilocybin, I think some of it was 10, some of it was 25 milligrams, which is, to give you an index, that's about 4 grams of cubensis if you get the 25 milligram hit. They still had this kind of internalized idea that what they were doing was something that was that was illegal, that had this kind of quality about it. So I think that for me, what we have to do is we have to really understand that we are still in a war. The drug war is still happening. As we're having this conversation now, people are having police batter down their front doors in order to stop them growing weed, despite the fact that British Sugar are currently growing a vast glasshouse in Norfolk of weed under license by the British government. We have to understand that while DMT and psilocybin are being researched as valuable medicines, people are being arrested for producing, supplying, trading and owning those substances which they are not licensed to have. And in that kind of context, I think we have to really do some stuff. So one thing I would suggest that it's important for us to do is to be involved in movements that aim to change the legal status of these substances and the people who can use those substances. We've seen great strides being made, particularly in North America, but also in places like Portugal with its decriminalization process, which it had to do because there were so many people dying of opiate overdoses and cocaine-related illness. We've seen in the US really powerful movements, the so-called decriminalized nature movement, which I think has been really, really helpful in terms of getting a number of the substances that people find valuable and useful, which, because of course we can understand that people can self-medicate with these things, as well as them being pleasurable and fun and interesting. And from my perspective, part of my cultural, spiritual kind of lineage, there are also things which people kind of use to help them. You know, cannabis is a great example of that. So to be able to make these things more widely available is really important. And I'm a great supporter of the use of these things within a medical context, because I believe that it's crazy that a person who is a good and caring healer like Ben Sessa, who's incredibly well versed with the use of psychedelics and particularly MDMA to help people with trauma, that he can't be just helping train loads of people who will be going out and doing this work. You know, we're going to have an epidemic of trauma-related illnesses as a result of the pandemic, and that's going to be like a really big thing. It's going to echo down probably at least the next generation. So we really need to be making sure that we're using these things which we know are valuable, and they're valuable in the medical context. Clinicians should be able to use these substances. But I think it's also important to look at the kind of the wider environment in which we find ourselves. And we really have to look at ways of dealing with these things in a very different way. We have to be able, as far as we as individuals can do, to be able to witness and disclose and talk about the fact that we may have had valuable, important, transformative, healing, joyous, fun, safe, entertaining psychedelic experiences. It's really, really essential that we find ourselves the language and the context in which we can do those kinds of things. And that's why things like the Oxford Psychedelic Society are really important, because they're important places for people to affirm that. And it's also important for us to take those experiences and talk about those more widely. I would suggest it's also probably important for us to look at the position of people who are in jail or facing jail as a result of their use of these substances. There's a kind of a trope in our culture, and again, this is a bit like the illegal drugs trope of the evil dealer. There are all those terrible, terrible dealers. Look at them doing their terrible things. Look at them making money. Look at them, you know, this is a thing. That's again a series of ideas that have kind of grown up into culture that need to be challenged. One thing I always find really interesting is the way that a number of psychedelic substances that have been released onto the market, once it's been discovered that they are potentially hazardous or people use them in a hazardous way, and I'm thinking of things like bromo dragonfly and some of the N-bone series of chemicals, a number of people who were producing those substances stopped doing so. So there is definitely a morality in this. And there's certainly a morality if you look at people like William Leonard Pickard. So the person, the individual who was busted at the end of the 90s for producing LSD, if you read his book, The Rosa Paracelsus, you can see that part of Pickard's mission was to produce this medicine, which he, however perhaps erroneously, believed could help transform culture for the better. And this guy found himself in prison for 20 years. He was amazingly released last year because he was determined to suffer 2 life sentences in a maximum security jail in the Arizona desert with a bunch of people who have many significant problems, let's call it. So we need to support our prisoners. Yeah, if you buy a psychedelic substance from somebody else, that person faces jail potentially, depending on where they are. And so we need to transform that situation. And I'm using that word because one of the organizations I actually helped found was an organization called Transform. So you can find them online, Transformed Drugs, and they're campaigning for not only psychedelics, but a much more humane and better way of dealing with all of these substances. In the academic context, what I would suggest is that people who have found these things to be useful, as far as possible, should try their best to disclose that, to talk about that, and to change some of this narrative around things like the evil dealer and also the idea of illegal drugs, and to challenge those things in the same way that we might be empowered to challenge racism, sexism, and other forms of prejudice that we find in our workplace. I would suggest that this is something that we should also attempt to actively challenge and to try and make some kind of changes with the way that these things operate within our culture. We're at a difficult time. We're at a difficult time. And we need these medicines. We need these medicines to be available in lots of good ways. And however we handle this, we need to bring this into a situation where we can have these adult and open and thoughtful conversations. Now, I wanted to have a conversation like that with the administrator who banned me from Oxford, but then there was a pandemic, and then we couldn't do it anyway. So perhaps I'll still be able to have that conversation with that individual, and I'll be able to talk about and challenge these ideas about illegal drugs, particularly because I think the only time I'm on record of saying where I've taken a drug is actually the time in London, where it was licensed and perfectly legit. But we need to challenge these things, and we need to bring out this kind of discussion. And I've kind of done this in a slightly indirect way. And I've done that by publishing the banned lecture of Getting Higher, partly because it had a lovely symmetry for me. Because 90 years ago, last year, my cultural ancestor, Aleister Crowley, was banned from speaking at the Oxford University Poetry Society. There, I think that the idea, although it was never really discussed, was perhaps not that he'd taken, quote, illegal drugs, but that occultism and magic were these dangerous things, and he was the wickedest man in the world, and therefore the delicate nature of the students should be protected from such a nefarious individual. He published his lecture, and I think it's still in print actually, and donated the profits at the time to the Oxford Poetry Society. So I've done the same with my lecture, which amusingly enough was going to be about how to get high without using drugs. How Wonderlandian that logic, that someone who has used psychedelics but is actually going to speak about not using psychedelics can be banned from speaking to a psychedelic society, a seat of learning. Something has to change, I would suggest. Thank you very much for listening.
Amazing. Thank you so much for that, Julian. What a note to end on. That was fantastic. And a really, really important discussion to be had, and to situate the kind of conversations we're having right now in the wider context. So yeah, thank you so much for that. That was really, really brilliant. If anyone does have a question, feel free to put it in the chat now, or if you're watching on the live stream, feel free to put it in the comments. We can unmute you and you can speak your question directly. I'll give it a few moments to see if anyone has one. Or else I'll start with one as well, just from our perspective as the Oxford Psychedelic Society. What role you think that societies have, because obviously, you know, we are limited in what we can do. What specific role do you think we play in this with the platform that we've got?
That's very interesting. I mean, I would have to turn that question around and ask the society how it feels that it could work, because I don't know the details of the context. I would say a couple of things. I would say that while we're on Zoom or in the pub or perhaps a building in a college where we've not been banned from when we're having these conversations, we must be really thoughtful about the fact that many people are in these difficult situations. And that's why I think it's really important that, as well as celebrating and being interested in the benefits that psychedelics can give us, we need to be very aware. We need to, for example, you know, everyone should have the phone number of an organization like Release or one of those other support organizations, you know, with them, so that in a situation where they find themselves in trouble, they have got a strategy for how to work. I would suggest that we also need solidarity, so that someone who is busted for selling some drugs doesn't become this imagined terrifying evil dealer, that they become simply a person who, certainly in the kind of some of the shamanic circles that I move in, would be described as a medicine carrier rather than a drug dealer, partly because of the linguistic thing. You know, the drug dealer is bad, isn't it? Like, we know that drug dealer is a bad thing. That's how we imagine it. So to have some kind of mechanisms for supporting those individuals who find themselves in those settings, to empower people to understand the context in which they find themselves, and then to do the usual stuff, make representations to elected representatives at all levels possible. I mean, I'm gratified to know that the Conservative Drug Policy Reform Group, which that organisation has produced an amazing report which has gone to the Conservative Party to look at their to change their drug policy, and it looks like the kind of document that probably lots of people here would be very, very supportive of. So it's not like this conversation isn't being had even within the contexts of political organisations that we might imagine as not our immediate obvious allies. So it has to be a campaigning process, and it has to exist on lots and lots of different levels, because otherwise we're a bit like Benny Shannon saying, well, I've taken loads of ayahuasca and I've written this academic book and I'm having a lovely time. And then when you say, well, yeah, but what about the actual ayahuasca? You kind of, you don't have anything to say. Yeah, so even just making sure that that discussion happens, so protecting people, ensuring that they have got strategies to deal with the fact that this is still life during wartime, supporting people who find themselves caught up in the war and not othering those individuals and assuming that they are bad, because that's the cultural trope that we have to work with, and ensuring that we make representations to people who are in positions of power of whatever type, in order that we don't close down this conversation and we actively move forward with things like decriminalisation of nature on one hand, and also the medical accessibility for people on in another domain, and also changes to the law so that the penalties that could be visited on people are nowhere near as significant as they currently are. I mean, I've got the figures somewhere between of the imprisonments between 2005 and 2015, I think it is. And there's a relatively small number of people in jail for psychedelics, but when they go down, they tend to go down in a big way. Casey Hardison, when he was arrested a number of years back in Britain, I think was sentenced to, I think it was maybe, I mean, Darryl will correct me, but maybe it was 20 years. It was this very, very significant sentence, of which I think he served something like 11. So yeah, we really need to think of our work as psychedelic societies, I would suggest, as campaigning organizations, as well as communities of support and mutual regard. You know, there's a number of organizations that are kind of out there that will quite happily allow you to come along to, you know, psychedelic this and psychedelic that, and here's this experience and here's that experience. But what we're doing is we're just we're having a great time, and we're doing important stuff, but we're doing it within this broader context of prejudice and misinformation and hypocrisy and punitive law, and that's what we should work to change. I hope, does that answer that one, Clara? Is that?
Yeah, absolutely. No, that was great. Thank you very much for that. That was a really informative answer. Tonya, do you have a question that you wanted to ask? You raised your hand. Have you just disappeared? Oh, I'm gonna unmute you now.
Hi, thank you. So I tend to agree with you, yet you know, I feel the challenge as well. And I've noticed that something's come up in America. There's a guy named Greg Lake, and he's a solicitor, and he's looking at speaking with people in different states about how the law could allow spiritual, cultural ceremonies, and how, and he's consulting with these different groups about how it is that they can have their services. And, you know, I think there's also this case for cognitive liberty as well. And I think Breaking Conventions had a wonderful woman who's a solicitor, and she, you know, if I needed representation, and, you know, it was the first case, I'd be like, yes, I want her to represent, if I needed it in this country, of course. But yeah, just wondered, you know, do you know of any organizations like that? And do you think that that's a good avenue? Because I think it's pretty intimidating as an individual to try and come out, so to speak. And, you know, it bothers me, really. You know, I'd really like to be able to advocate in a helpful way. And aside from these really dry facts about things, which it doesn't really cut it, you know, it's not representing all sides of it. And I don't really want to see it be a medical kind of a thing primarily, although I do believe in the importance of setting and having the right conditions. I don't want to see it just go forward, and I don't want the, you know, cultural reappropriation and things like that. So yeah, any kind of suggestions on, you know, or organizations that you might suggest, or how, you know, a little bit more about how, if you know. Thank you.
Yeah, no, no. Thank you for the question. I think you've raised some interesting points there, because there are the directions we can come at this from a religious or spiritual direction. So you've got things like the Native American Church, who of course have had an ongoing battle, which is, you know, still by no means done and dusted. It's an ongoing process for their use of peyote. You've got things like the ayahuasca using churches, you know, the UDV, Santa Daime, people like this. You've got then, aside of the religious aspect, you've got the medical processes and contexts in which we could talk about these things. And we also have this idea of cognitive liberty, and I think that's a really interesting kind of idea. I remain sort of somewhat uncertain about how that would play out, certainly in a British legal context. I mean, I'm by no means a legal professional, but I can see how people like Casey Hardison have attempted to use that as a you know, an important plank of their defence and their position. And even if it's not a legitimate defence in law, then I think it's still an ethical and philosophical position that's worth kind of exploring. I would like to be able to see. I mean, I think it's interesting in a sort of Protestant, post-Protestant culture, like the sort of a lot of the British and kind of to some extent kind of American envelope. There's also a really interesting deeper tension that I see between whether or not you can do something because it's fun, and whether or not you're only allowed to do that thing if you're sick. So medical marijuana became, you know, you were allowed to smoke cannabis if you were having, you know, or take cannabis if you were suffering from incredibly debilitating fits and seizures. And then you were able to take marijuana if you were suffering from perhaps significant arthritis and so on. And then eventually got to the point where you could take marijuana because you might enjoy it. And that's really interesting. There's a lot of interesting stuff to do with what we believe about pleasure, and what we believe about recreation, and what we believe about human nature as well. So it brings up a lot of those kind of interesting kind of discussions. So I've got an organization called Scales. Scalesofjustice.org is the website address, and that's a little just the front end for a process that I've initiated, which is about supporting psychedelic prisoners. And I'm working with some people, working with various organizations, including some people in the US, to look at how do we support people who are in jail. You know, I was a correspondent with Leonard Pickard for a number of years before his release, and but he's not alone. Yeah, there's a lot of people. You know, as I said, the figures certainly in Britain between 2005 2015, it's a small number of people in jail for psychedelics. It's a larger number of people in jail for what we could describe as a psychedelic substance, which is MDMA. So MDMA, you know, I think that it's several hundreds of people a year find themselves in that kind of setting. So I've kind of started in a small way doing some of this work. I don't know of any other kind of major organizations that are involved in that, but I think over the next few years we'll see that. And I hope very much it will follow the same process that we've seen in the United States, with as decriminalization of cannabis has happened, what's happened is that a lot of people who were in jail for uh, supplying cannabis have found themselves released, and some of them and their criminal convictions abolished and overturned and so on. So that's an important kind of part of the process. Britain is by no means leading the way on this, by no means leading the way. I mean, the novel psychoactives bill of, I think it's like 2015, something like this, which basically criminalizes everything you could conceivably use. Like if you walk into a shop and say, I'd like a biro, I intend to get high using the biro through some bizarre process, it would be a criminal offence for the person to sell you the biro. You know, if you were to take the ink and, you know, whatever. Same with, in theory, something like frankincense. Frankincense works to elevate the mood. It has psychoactive properties. But if you went and bought it saying, I'm going to hotbox in a kind of Old Testament style, and I'm going to have loads of this stuff, and I'm going to get really high, again, they would be theoretically criminally liable. But again, it's the war on some people to take some drugs. So the exclusions include various things, including amusingly poppers. And if you go and have a look at either like a Hansard, or I think there might even be some YouTube footage of this, you can see a Tory MP saying, well, the problem with this bill is I like poppers, so can we not make those illegal? And that's what happened, basically. So those were not criminalized, even though there's a substance you can get called miracle berry. So miracle berry is a substance which blocks the receptor to sour in your mouth, and it's just a berry. It's a plant, and it has this kind of hour-long receptor effect. But because it's effectively something that comes under the aegis of the bill, Amazon dropped the product from Britain because they went, no, because otherwise people will be, I don't know, eating lemons and experiencing them as sweet. And what a terrible thing that would be. Yeah. And that's how crazy this thing is. That's how I saw the legislation go through, and there were 4 models that were given to government, 4 ways of dealing with the problem. The problem was essentially synthetic forms of cannabinoids. So it was spice and drugs like that they saw as being really problematic, you know, for some people. And they were given 4 options, and they chose the most draconian of the options, which was basically ban everything that isn't, you know, alcohol or tobacco or caffeine. That was the one that was taken. So yeah, we just, you know, maybe we have to set up more organizations. We have to do more work to kind of get this really into to change the way this thing is in culture. And fundamentally, of course, what we have to do is we have to talk to elected representatives, because those are the people who go and pass the laws. Those are the people who are involved in this, and those are the people who essentially we have to be recruiting and getting on side in one way or another. And it's going to be a difficult thing to do. But
thank you for your organization, and I'll look into that definitely. And I know that there's some research as well on the well-being, and I think MAPS is angling towards well-being approaches as being just as valid. So yes, I will keep on, and I will look up your organization. Thank you for your work. Thanks so much.
Thanks for your question, Tony.
Thank you for your answer. And we've got another question from Matilda. I'm going to unmute you now.
Hi, I was just wondering your thoughts on, I'm a neuroscience graduate student right now, and I've been hearing a lot of the fellow neuroscientists I know who do work with psychedelics wanting to spin them in this light that's like essentially making non-hallucinogenic psychedelics to extract all of the goodness of psychedelics and leave behind the psychedelicness. And I've been trying to parse out why they want to do it, but my thoughts are that they want to do it to make it more palatable for people. So I was wondering if you have any thoughts on that concept, if you've heard of it, how like I can combat that kind of narrative, because like I don't want to do that in my work. You know what I mean?
Yeah. You know, it's a really, really interesting, really, really good question. Very timely in terms of the work that's being done. I have come across that work, and I've looked at some of the material, some of the ideas that are being sort of mooted. I haven't read any of the sort of, I don't know if there's any kind of primary papers that have been published on this in terms of the research, but I've heard the idea being kicked around for a little while. Obviously, with cannabis, one of the things that was was talked about is, could you create cannabis medicines that would have the effect that you wanted? So, for example, anti-anorexic medicines that would make people have the munchies, and they would do that, but it wouldn't get them high in any kind of sense. Again, this kind of goes back to some interesting things. One, it goes back to the relationship that we have, the problematic relationship that many of our cultures have with joy, with fun, with recreation, with pleasure. So that's a very interesting thing. And whilst I can understand that you might conceivably have a class of drugs that would be medically useful, I would also suggest that my experience with the psychedelics as we encounter them now is that the internal journey process is the subjective aspect of the kind of physiological changes or neurological changes that are happening with novel connections at the level of the neurons in the brain, and that they arise into these subjective feelings, and it's those subjective feelings which are actually the valuable thing. So when I spoke in at the conference that I mentioned in the university in Northampton, the paper that I gave was all about the importance of new metaphors in psychedelic healing. So if you go and listen to lots of accounts of people with their psychedelic experience and what they got out of it and so on, you'll often find that there is a series of new metaphorical understandings that they've gained from the experience, and it's those things that one might suggest are the novel connections at a neurological level that arise into these subjective perceptions of a new metaphor. Metaphor, of course, is to carry across, to move something from one place to another. So, even metaphor is a literal metaphor in that kind of sense. So I think that the subjective component of this is really important, because many of the conditions that we're talking about are primarily subjective things. If you have post-traumatic stress disorder, you could approach this as a purely a kind of functional, neurological, anatomical process. But most of where you're dealing primarily with symptoms rather than any signs. People don't necessarily change color when they've got PTSD, but they do have various things happening in their minds. And psychedelics, the benefit of them is that they are substances that allow us to go in and explore for ourselves in a certain container the way our minds are and the way our relationships are with things, and they allow us to do our own healing. This is one of the things I'm interested in with the medical discourse, is that because you have to sit with someone through a psilocybin journey of 4 or 5 hours, something like this could radically change medicine. So rather than it just being a question of, here are your pills, go away, come back in 2 weeks time if you don't feel a bit less mad, then to have medicine that involves this much deeper relationship between the therapist or the supporter, the healer in a kind of shamanic register of language, and the person who is doing the healing for themselves through this visionary state, I think that is a very valuable thing. I wouldn't want to see that not happen, because I think that might transform medicine itself for the better. Those classes of drugs, if indeed they become available, it will be really interesting to see how we work with them. But also we know that psilocybin, as it stands right now with the protocols that have been developed, MDMA, as it stands right now with the protocols that have been developed, is incredibly safe and incredibly effective. So why are we trying to take the trippiness out of it? If we went to talk therapy, it's a bit like saying, well, we'd like talk therapy, but without any talking. That's what we'd like. We'd like to be able to just sort of give you talk therapy as a pill, but not bother with the talk therapy, and then maybe you'll get better. I mean, perhaps it would work. Perhaps for some people it might be valuable. We know that serotonin reuptake inhibitors, overprescribed though they may well be, for some people are valuable medicine for some periods of time to get them through difficult circumstances. Yeah, that's okay. So I certainly wouldn't want to not see those drugs explored and developed, but I would want to question, why do we want to take away this powerful internal journey when in talk therapy we want a powerful internal journey? And we know that some talk therapy can be very successful, and for some people it can really work. And why would we want to abandon what might well be a very new way of doing medicine, which from my perspective as an occultist is also an echo of an archaic way of doing medicine, which may have had a number of benefits, not only for the patient, but for the culture within which that style of medicine is practiced, and for the skill of the clinicians as well. Does that answer that one all right?
Yeah, I also, like, when you were saying that last bit, it kind of crystallized this idea that I've been bouncing around in my head for a while. It's that they just want to make a new type of antidepressant. Is like, it's an easy basis to start off of. We know that the plasticity is really important for antidepressive activity, and like, this is an easy, like, you're just taking nature's little gems and being like, okay, we'll just take them and bye.
Yeah, and the interesting thing about that is that, okay, so we've got neuroplasticity. We know that there are these great kind of affinities for that process, particularly with things like psilocybin and the tryptamines. I would want to be very thoughtful about, if we're just creating a more plastic brain, what context does that plastic brain find itself in? Because if it finds itself in the same difficult series of kind of subloops, if it finds itself in a context where it's not being supported, how is that going to work out exactly? I'd be really, really interested to find out, what we're going to do with that, because I would think that even if we're creating enhanced neuroplasticity, we would still want to combine that with some kind of talk therapy. We would still want to combine that, probably, to be frank, with pragmatic interventions into that person's life situation. Lots of people have depression partly because loads of people are broke and loads of people are suffering in a variety of economic, social, contextual ways. I remember talking to Professor Torsten Passy, who wrote a brilliant book on microdosing. So The Science of Microdosing Psychedelics, really, really good book. Talking to him about a conference that he went to with psychologists and analysts and so on in Berlin, and him saying that there was hardly anyone in the neurological sections of the conference, because everyone's basically given up. They've gone, look, we look at a brain with OCD, and we look at a brain with PTSD, and we look at a brain with some other stuff, and we don't actually see much functional difference. So this must be more kind of culturally situated. But the session that was massively oversubscribed was basically doctors going, look, we can make people a bit better, but then we reinsert them back into a culture which is hugely troubling and suffering and difficult. And maybe we need to do something else in terms of looking at the environment as well. So if we're creating enhanced flexibility and plasticity within brains, that's okay. But I would want to then think about, you still have the set and setting. You still would have that kind of element. So how would you address that? And how has that got any better? Because it sounds very much like, what you're aiming to do here is to prescribe a happy pill. People go away, and in 2 weeks' time, they feel a lot happier. I mean, maybe it'll be valuable, but I think it might be an example of missing the point.
I agree. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you for that, Julian. We've got a question from Kenneth. I'm meeting you now.
Hi, thanks so much for the great talk. I was just curious if you had any books that you could recommend on ritualistic use of psychedelics, mainly for facilitating mystical states of awareness.
That's a very good question. Wow, books on psychedelics and mystical states of awareness. I mean, I don't know that there are various books that are kind of specific to various substances. So there's work on, I remember reading one guy, I forget his name off the top of my head, about psychedelic cannabis and using that in a kind of therapeutic stroke mystical kind of a way. You'll find that they're writing out things like 5-MeO and salvia and so on. The only thing that I'm immediately aware of, and this is not product placement, is the thing that I wrote, Getting Higher. Someone's just put in the chat there, Psychedelics and Spirituality. Yeah, and there's also Psychedelic Mysteries of the Feminine. I think has got some stuff about kind of ritualistic use in there. If you want the history within the Western magical tradition, you'd be looking at things like Libra 420 by Chris Bennett that I mentioned earlier. And if you want kind of some of the backstory of things like the development of the Native American church, because that's a relatively recent psychedelic ritual. That's kind of like latter part of the 20th century, that began. Latter part of the 19th century that began to develop. Then there's a book called Mescaline, a history of the first global psychedelic, I think it's called. It's behind me somewhere, by a guy called Mike J. That's very good. But yeah. Kenneth, go and buy yourself a copy of Getting Higher if you haven't already got one, mate. That might help. You might find that interesting.
Brilliant. We've got another request for literature recommendations from Sebastian, who I think has left. Sebastian, if you are still in the meeting, you can unmute yourself now, but I think you've gone. In which case, I'm quite interested to hear what your answer is, so I'm going to ask a question. Is there any specific literature you would recommend to read about using psychedelic experiences for personal growth?
See, again, there are lots of interesting texts about particular kind of medicines and particular kind of substances. But in terms of reading about these kind of things, I think that I can't think of any kind of text that immediately grabbed me off the top of my head. I should probably have gone through my bookcase before the session in order to come up with some good suggestions. I think that you can look, it depends on how you're framing the idea of spiritual growth, because sometimes this is framed within particular religious or kind of spiritual traditions. But I would say actually that you don't need to look for something that's specific about psychedelics. The thing about psychedelics that's kind of interesting is that because they're so plastic, they can be read in a number of different ways. You know, you can read this thing as a hero's journey. You can read this thing as the metaphors or the models that are being used by people like, I don't know, Robin Carr Harris or Rosalind Watts or whatever. But fundamentally, this is all a series of like metaphorical processes to understand what's going on. So you can read almost any book about spirituality and about the different kind of areas that you might kind of encounter, and then think about it in relation to your own kind of use of psychedelics. So, for example, there's an interesting book called Secret Drugs of Buddhism by Mike Crowley, and that looks at the kind of the historical and some of the relationships between Buddhist tradition and psychedelics. But I'll have a think, and if I can come up with any better suggestions than someone said, Bill Richards' Sacred Knowledge, yeah, and there's also, I haven't actually encountered this yet, but I know that Groff has produced a Psychonaut's Way, I think it is, which I suspect has a lot of that kind of material in there. There's a lot of material online. Obviously, the two big websites are Iroid and Psychonaut Psychonaut Wiki. There's a lot of kind of ideas to be had from those, but what I would do is to look at maybe some of those entheogenic lineaged cultures and the way that they use those substances. One of my favorites is the Native American church community and the way that they've made use of peyote in their ceremonies. So it's scattered far and wide. There are a few books that bring stuff together, but I think it's with the thing about psychedelics is that it's still a relatively, the idea of psychedelic spirituality, there are lots of kind of classic books, things like the Psychedelic Experience based on the Manual of the Tibetan Book of the Dead. Now that will give you like one version, but it will give it within the envelope of a particular sort of spiritual tradition or a reimagined form of the spiritual tradition. But yeah, it's kind of a wide field. There's a I don't know how many books are produced about psychedelics every year now. It's probably approaching 3 figures, I would have thought, something of that order. So if anyone's got any other great suggestions, then please drop them into the chat. I think a few others have gone into that.
Yeah, thank you for that. Do we have a time for a last question?
Yes, I have another one.
Amazing. Okay, Carolyn, I'm gonna unmute you now if you want to ask your question.
Thank you for being here. I just had a question regarding ketamine-assisted psychotherapy. In the US, it's being used kind of like as like an approved gateway to the psychedelic realm. And it's happening alongside like the legalization of psilocybin and kind of post legalization of cannabis. And I'm just wondering if it's similar over there and how you're feeling in terms of like it opening doors, especially like in the allopathic medical community. If you feel like it's a good tool, or if it's just something safe.
That's a very good question, Carolyn. I mean, obviously, the situation with ketamine is interesting because ketamine didn't end up as one of the baddies in the war on drugs, and the kind of what rather charmingly used to be called re-emergent phenomena that clinicians were warned about, so that people would come out of as being anaesthetized with ketamine and saying, I've just seen God and my ancestors and all kinds of weird, Tron, and it's all weird. So people were kind of talked about this. But then as ketamine became more recognized as a psychedelic substance, and although it works in a slightly kind of novel way neurologically, as I understand it, it definitely has a psychedelic kind of component, but it's used and it's been a sort of a bridgehead, if you like, for the other psychedelics because it never became a drug that was significantly kind of criminalized. As a substance itself, I certainly think it has great value. I'm also I guess slightly concerned about it, and I speak as somebody who thinks that ketamine is a valuable and the language I would use would be like sacred medicine. Slightly concerned about it because, of course, it is essentially an anesthetic and dissociative. And so when people are in difficult circumstances, as the Rat Park experiment famously demonstrates, they will self-medicate with things that cover up or mitigate their suffering. And anything that allows us not to feel will do that very successfully. So while ketamine itself may have great value, it certainly seems to have great value in interrupting suicidal ideation for people who are having a really, really hard time. So what has those kind of values, I'm also I would like people to be quite thoughtful about the idea that we are prescribing a medication relatively widely, and I know in the US it seems to have really really burgeoned as an industry, which is a drug that is a dissociative. Yeah. So the thing about psychedelics is that they're not necessarily in and of themselves good. They are things that are valuable from a medical point of view within that kind of envelope, within that particular kind of setting of the medical process. It's what was being talked about earlier with the idea of psychedelic substances or psychedelic medicines without the actual getting high, tripping kind of component. Ketamine is it's very easy to manage people when they're taking their ketamine infusion. You don't necessarily have to worry about what's on the wall or whatever. But of course, the fact is that you actually do. It just becomes one of those things where, the ketamine lozenge is prescribed. It would seem and fairly kind of accessible, at least in the US, for people who have the money to have that as part of their health provision. In Britain, these substances are being used. I'm uncertain about exactly what the situation is at the moment with the number of clinicians who are using ketamine, particularly on the sort of basis of private practice. I think it's a valuable medicine, but like any medicine, we have to think about the context in which it's used. And I think that because it has this kind of dissociative aspect to it, D.M. Turner famously described it, he described it as psychedelic heroin. So to really use this medicine well, I think again we have to think about the context in which it's used and the support that's given to people. Yes, it can be valuable, but it could also be potentially quite kind of problematic. I'm pleased that because of the legal story, as far as ketamine is concerned, it has been easier to release its potential as a psychedelic medicine. That is a good thing. And that's something I want to celebrate. And I certainly wouldn't want to problematize this drug any more than any other. Yeah, people can have all sorts of poor interactions and difficult relationships with any number of different substances. It's not the substance, it's the context. And for people who perhaps aren't familiar with that, I guess most people here are, the Rat Park experiment really, really clearly kind of talks about this in relation to addiction. So yeah, valuable medicine. I would like to make sure that we are very thoughtful about things like the duration with which this is prescribed, and to look at the environments in which the substance is taken. And I mean both the immediate setting and the support around those people who are using it for its medicinal benefit. I think that's where I'm with that.
Great, thank you. We do need to wrap up now, but Daryl, if you have a quick comment that you'd like to make.
Do it, Daryl.
That was wonderful. You speak so beautifully, particularly my favourite subjects included. I know very clever people are listening here, and the thing about clever people is they like to focus very deeply on individual things. And we talk specifically a lot about individual drugs and individual purposes, which there's nothing wrong with that. But at the same time, we have to be wary in the wider context that this is making a little bit of a fetish of our freedom and our status as human beings. And this is really what talking about substances does, rather than talking about people and our rights to cognitive liberty, for example, which should be completely. Sorry, you couldn't see me before. I'd had my sticker up. So when we're talking about things like licensing and decriminalization of drugs, again, I would go further and try to push the language back to the human-centric paradigm, because obviously drugs are not criminals, and drugs can't apply for licenses. And I know people listening to this for the first time might find this a little bit pedantic, but when we must sort of understand how intimate this subject is with us. We're literally becoming one with these substances that we've evolved with, and that we're permeable to, and that we have receptors for. And yet we talk about it in such abstract terms. Not you, although obviously, some of the questions when they're coming in, people are talking about, do you think psilocybin can be decriminalized or can be legalized, and these kind of questions. That sadly, the group that you helped set up, Transform, they seem to still be pushing this paradigm. And I know it does seem a little bit strange for people at first when they first hear it, but there are a lot of reasons why I'm really encouraging people to use the human-centric paradigm. But there won't be time to go into the legal niceties about how the law could make exemptions and authorities for people, like you talk about licensing. Licensing people, and because we can exempt people, we can give people authorizations, and these things only come to light once the idea of a substance having legal status, which is something I know we still cling to, but really it's just something in a table. It doesn't really have legal status. The legal status always applies to the person. And I think by reversing the language to the actual correct form, not to a mythical form, but actually taking it away from its illusory mythical form and into the correct legal form, noting that we are controlled with respect to controlled drugs, rather than drugs are illegal, that's it, we will actually rescue autonomy. So, I mean, a lot of people are asking for reading materials. I'm not suggesting anything, but I think an understanding about rights and trying to develop an understanding of how cognitive liberty precedes such ideas as freedom of thought and freedom of expression, that people sort of look at it in this sort of quasi-political sense, a sociological sense, and then start to get a stronger position of advocacy and be able to express this whole subject entirely from their own heart and exactly how they relate to nature and to these substances that are just part of the continuum. It's not really a question of self and other. It's a question of union between what we perceive as ourselves and our environments that's being regulated by words. And we must try to get these words right, because at the moment, I do believe that prohibition is being supported by the misuse of language. And the idea is that there's something that we use called a transferred epithet, which is a shortcut in language, so that we would sort of maybe talk about this is a disabled toilet. We know what it means, but actually the toilet isn't disabled. It means toilet for the disabled person. And that's what we've done with illegal drugs. The drug which is illegal to possess without license, exemption, or authority has become the illegal drug. And in so doing that, we lost all of our agency, all the possibility of regulations, which are under, I said I wouldn't say this, but in the Misuse of Drugs Act, do see section 7, 22 and 31. And also bear in mind, I think this was a little mistake from somebody earlier, there is no crime of using drugs either. So that's the reason there's no crime of using drugs, is that we can differentiate between the use and the misuse, which is exactly what all responsible people are about. Nobody wants to encourage drug misuse, but we don't want to close down all use. And the law allows that when we understand that the law isn't really just the law, it's a tool to be administered by the government of the day. So the Misuse of Drugs Act sets out to make all this possible, but all those possibilities are being closed down by this illegal and legal drugs binary system. It's dehumanizing. And of course, by creating illegal drugs, you also create legal drugs, which don't exist either. But that means people are being let off completely from any responsibility or accountability under the Misuse of Drugs Act, which is there as a neutral law to protect against the harms caused by drug misuse by anybody with any drug. And yet we've got this whole sort of partisan separation between people, and it's all down to language. So I'd encourage anybody who wants to know more about that to contact me at Drug Equality, and I'll fill in. Thanks so much, Julian, because you're a real ally for me in this cause, and I hope I can help you as well in any way. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Errol. Just to echo those points, and you know, as I say, I don't have a legal background, but I'm very aware, as some of the things that I've tried to bring up in this talk about, you know, the imagined evil drug user, the notion of illegal drugs being so embedded that even researchers who are working with licensed material believe that these are illegal drugs. Like this is, you know, these words do matter. And what matters is that we kind of change some of our language, we change some of our behavior, and we encourage those changes to happen in wider culture. So yeah, totally, my friend, totally.
Yeah, thank you.
Amazing. What a powerful ending. Oh, thank you so much for that, Julian, for sharing your time and your thoughts and opening this space in this discussion. That's been really, really useful and some powerful messages there. So thank you very, very much. And thank you everyone for coming, and everyone a really, really lovely evening.
Fantastic. Thank you, Clara. Thank you everyone for being here. Thank you, Oxford Psychedelic Society.